easier to run it from the CD as it was. So what I'm trying to say is a lot of people think they need their Windows applications. I'm not sure how many people will actually truly need them, and how many people will in fact practically use that. If you get my point, and I was wondering if you could maybe say something about that. I mean, how much do we depend on running binaries that are Windows binaries today, based on what you've seen?
It's strange because, I was actually, funny enough, as you were talking about, I just actually pulled up my Wine folder just to see what I had installed, because I have got Wine on here at the moment. Now, the last time I used Wine seriously was for my World of Warcraft addiction, which I managed to kick off for about 6 months, I believe, and that was in about 2008, I think. And I think, after I've just said about users having a sort of comfort blanket or comfort zone for Windows, I think maybe that my installation of Wine is there for that purpose as well, because the last time I used it, to my knowledge, was when I did a comparison of two media players. One was seen as the best Windows media player, and one was seen as a very good Linux media player. So I was just comparing the two, and I used Wine to run the Windows one, obviously. But no, I mean, I could delete it now, and I certainly wouldn't miss it. No,
Yeah,
I think.
Sorry.
So like I say, I think I'll go on record now, because I did blog about Wine quite a few times. I'll go on record now and I'll say I believe it was 2008 with World of Warcraft when I got over that, which was when I stopped seriously using it. Having said that, I'll add a caveat to that, because I do use DOSBox. I've got a lot of old PC titles, a lot of gaming titles from the yesteryear that I play, retro titles that I bought, and I'm loath to throw away because I think they'll be worth some money in about 20, 30 years' time. And Scum, obviously, but that technically isn't like Wine. So yeah, basically that's all I've got. That's my only connection to it.
That's fine. Obviously, if you go back to the days of DOS, you're not even talking about Windows or not even strictly Microsoft. You had all kinds of DOS operating systems. And actually, it reminds me of a joke. I saw recently a person referring to something called MS-DOS, where MS-DOS means multi-source denial of service. So it's a kind of a nice way to say, oh, I've just been attacked by an MS-DOS or something like that. But in any case, I personally, before I was using anything, and I grew up into the generation where we had the very early DOS versions, and I wasn't using Microsoft DOS until like a few years later, or like 5 years later. So, and then of course came Windows and the whole thing. But yeah, I was going to make a very it's interesting you mentioned the wife, for example. Some people think of the computer as being attached to an operating system and one company controlling the software, and they take that for granted, and they think that in very gentle ways companies can actually make people believe that or to feel that way. You know, thinking you have to buy a Mac, which is a different type of computer, to actually run a different operating system.
Yeah.
It's a very convenient myth for them.
I mean, it's also, I mean, you can see where it's grown up from, that idea as well, because, you know, you sort of go back to the early 90s when the home computer was very much sort of an Amiga and Atari ST, where, you know, and you can appreciate that somebody would switch on a machine, see Microsoft Windows, and assume that it's a Microsoft box, it's everything is Microsoft. So you can sort of see where that stereotype came from. And like I say, when they mention the word PC, they're referring to Windows PC, which is something completely different.
Yeah, of course, remember the computers usually have a sticker on them, and the sticker is kind of labels, and this computer is a Windows machine. And it's not a coincidence. It has some purpose beyond just the... obviously, maybe it's just a side effect, but one of the things it basically put is kind of like stamping someone or putting someone or making some sort of a tattoo on a person that to kind of mark him as part of a certain like group of people or whatever. So yeah, and one point I was gonna make before, and I was just about to say that I just gotta be slightly interrupted within my own mind. Is with Wine, you still have people very much accustomed to the notion of having to run the most basic things the way they're used to, so they might want to use Winamp, which by the way is going to run in Android, which is based on Linux. But Winamp, for example, is a player that I've been using since like 1997 or 96 or something like that. And this is a very good media player, but it's really an overkill to go into the different API and to cope with a different type of interface. You know, when you've got so many excellent media players in Linux. You don't actually need to do that. The same thing with the browsers. People, why? I mean, in the past, people were talking about running Internet Explorer on Linux, and I think that's because maybe perhaps I'm not sure. You see my hesitance here. I think because of ActiveX and more very essential sites, things to do with the public and interaction with governments, required you to use ActiveX. So they would have to even use what was called like IE for Linux, or you had all kinds of scripts and all kinds of hackable ways of running Internet Explorer in Linux. But these days you barely see that because we have Chrome, we have Firefox, and even the shape in terms of market share that Internet Explorer is sunk to has ensured that lots of webmasters would be absolutely ridiculed if they ignored browsers except for Microsoft's browser, because it's just unrealistic to do that. So people barely ever need to run Explorer unless they want to check the renderer on the browser. So if they are web designers, they probably want to have some access to a computer that has Explorer just to see what the pages look like. That's
Just a very quick question, Roy, because I've been trying to look for an answer for this for a while, and it's there's actually two parts to the question. But the first one, you mentioned Winamp, and a lot of people rave about Winamp. Now, the last time I used it, and again, this is throwing back a guess, but I'm going to say 2003, 2004 was probably the last time I used Winamp. What is the big deal about Winamp, say, compared to Audacious? Because I'm a staunch supporter of Audacious. I think it's a fantastic piece of software. And to me, as far as I remember, it does everything that Winamp does and more.
I'll tell my personal story, because it actually goes back to when I was a teenager, so I wasn't very much of an expert with computers back then. But what I could figure out was this is a time when very few players had support for MP3. So this was one of them which actually supported this. To me, it was a new format in the mid 90s, which was MP3s, because before that, everything we actually had encoded was in WAV format. And usually the things like, not necessarily Windows 95, you would have the things with interfaces in them, more DOS-based interfaces, but it was very accepted to have WAV files, and even everything in all kinds of programs, which it sounds, everything was like encoded. And WAV, of course, is a very raw format. It's just like the waves as they are, no compression, nothing whatsoever. Sometimes images were not properly compressed. And this was a player that could play these MP3 files, whatever they are, MPEG, or, you could get them from FTP servers in all kinds of places. And this was a time when, you probably wouldn't listen to CDs most of the time, and I know I did. So then came this player, and it could play these amazing things, like you could actually hear like a whole high quality song in like 2 or 3 megabytes, which is amazing. And I think back then it was more, some tracks would be 120, 112k per second, and some would be like 128k. I think these days it's a bit of a different standard, but, and one of the nice things about it was very light, and even if you ran it a few years later, it would just take very, very few megabytes. And the person who developed it was just a small team, and it was a small thing. As you probably know, it was then sold to AOL, and as far as I can tell, there is this set called Old Version, which some years later I was relying on, because the thing was becoming fatter and fatter and heavier, and just adding lots of features and lots of things you don't necessarily want, because personally speaking, I just want a player that just plays my songs and allows me to change tracks, because I usually do something else at the same time. And they added all this bloat, which made it impossible to use in some laptops, or would make it just a big component of the system, when all you have to do there is to just throw some data into the buffer, into the sound buffer, and just play the thing. It doesn't have to be heavy. It can just go there once in a few seconds, throwing some input to the buffer. And then, as far as I know, it kind of not disappeared. It just had a very, very strong brand, because lots of people used it back in the days, but it was no longer a very viable option to playing things. And of course, all kinds of companies like Real Player and Microsoft were pushing their big players as well, and putting all kinds of formats and DRM and who knows what into their players, also making it video players. And of course, now you have things like iTunes, and you have things having to connect to external media player, to PMPs and things like that. So I cannot tell you what happened after 2003 or so, but I know back then around version 3, the llama as like the mascot of the thing was